G'day, watch this.
I'd like to ask you now, if I may, about the GST. I heard you speak at Samuel Griffith Society function, and what particularly I drew from that was that you pointed out that when the GST was brought in, the Commonwealth moved its obligations to the territories, virtually to the states, because the GST was to be a tax for the states, and suddenly, subtly and perhaps surreptitiously, a Commonwealth obligation was then effectively imposed on the states.
Well, I'd be the first person to import malice on the part of the, the motivations of the Commonwealth, but I think here it was largely an accident. But it has been an ironic and unhelpful accident. So, as you point out, David, the GST was brought in to be a source of revenue and a growth source of revenue for the states. It probably hasn't grown as much as everyone had hoped for, but nevertheless it's a very healthy source of revenue for the states. There's a $50 billion pool of GST, give or take, and about $6 billion of that is donated away from the 4 major states. And almost 60% of that money donated away, so about 60% of $6 billion, goes to the Northern Territory. Now, the Northern Territory clearly has financial weaknesses and service delivery needs that require it to be subsidised, but the point that I think needs to be made is why should that responsibility for subsidising the Northern Territory fall on the states and their source of revenue rather than on the Commonwealth? And keeping in mind that prior to the advent of the GST, it had been genuinely Commonwealth money which had been used to subsidise the Northern Territory, and indeed all of the other states that from time to time required horizontal fiscal equalisation, so in effect a subsidy. That came from Commonwealth money. And I think one of the big problems structurally for the Federation is that, give or take, the Commonwealth government spends about 50% of all the expenditure in Australia, and the states the other 50%. So, give or take, half of the spending, half of the provision of services and capital is undertaken by the states, and the other half by the Commonwealth. The states raise about 16% of all of the revenue in Australia, and the Commonwealth about 80%. Now, that type of vertical fiscal imbalance leads to, I think, profligate spending at times at a Commonwealth level, too great a reliance on debt financing at a state level, and it does not lead to the best possible practices in taxation, because the level of government that gets the joy of spending money doesn't have the agony of having to raise it.
Yes, and they're told how to spend it.
Indeed.
But you have the Commonwealth telling the states.
Indeed. So, and I mean, there's not a serious economist who doesn't say that this isn't a problem. But ironically, the GST was meant to be a solution to this problem, because it was meant to provide the states with a secure source of revenue. But tragically, a large swathe of that revenue is being taken from the states and used as a subsidy to the Northern Territory and to, from time to time, South Australia and Tasmania. And previously, the Commonwealth had made that expenditure out of its own, clearly its own revenue. So the first and easiest way to make a dent in vertical fiscal imbalance is have the Commonwealth do what it always had done, subsidise the weaker states.
And I think that paper, the Toomey-Withers paper,
yes,
demonstrated that in those federations where the states raise their own money and spend their own money, and more inclined to do that, the benefit to the nation is greater. There is a cost in the system that we have. There's a cost paid by all taxpayers.
Yeah, I mean, we don't obviously have time to mull over 20 academic papers, but with respect to vertical fiscal imbalance, there have been a great number of empirical studies that show that federations with a greater correlation between raising and spending do better in most salient economic criteria than those with this very large amount of vertical fiscal imbalance. But there are ways in which this can be repaired and improved which aren't radical. And I'm not sure that having the Commonwealth subsume responsibility for funding the needs of the Northern Territory is particularly radical. In fact, it was the way that the Federation had always worked prior to the GST. And we've now got the Greiner-Rumby paper on the GST out, and I've had a bit of a look at some of the things that are being said there, and they seem to have broadened the debate into whether or not the rate or the base of the GST needs to be broadened or increased. But surely the first question is, how do you distribute it? And if you can't decide what's the best way to distribute the GST, you'll never get anything like a broad consensus of opinion about what rates and bases should be. I mean, that's an argument that's well and truly down the track.
I thought the completely unacceptable part of that report was this view, which came out in the Henry report, that the Commonwealth should really take over royalties, that mineral taxes should be a Commonwealth matter.
Well, they've done such a great job of mining tax policy recently, haven't they? I mean, why wouldn't we hand them over?
Yes.
Look, this is often said that royalties are an inefficient tax, and I think it makes two fundamental errors. First of all, it ascribes to royalties the status of a tax, which is trivially true, but in a way profoundly false, because royalties are the physical price that's paid for the physical receipt of a commodity which is constitutionally owned by the people of a state. So yes, it is ad valorem, and in that way it's not as flexible as a profits-based tax, but you are charging BHP or Rio or whoever else it may be for the goods that you are providing to them, which prior to their receipt of those goods were owned by the people of your state. Now,
I like that the people of the state, not the people of Australia, but the people of Western Australia, the people of New South Wales. That seems to be very clear, and that was glossed over by Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard.
I'm sure that Commonwealth governments from time to time wished it wasn't owned by people of the state, but constitutionally it is. And the thing about royalties is that every major mining and resource economy in the world has a royalty system, because it makes no sense to give your products away without charging a price for them. You then may wish to tax the companies that make profits out of this endeavour in certain ways, but royalties are not inefficient in the sense that they're an inefficient tax. And the second thing about royalties is that we've grown mineral and petroleum-based resource revenue and exports in this state by unbelievable quantities. I mean, this state now exports about $53 billion worth of produce trade to China. The entire exports of the United States to China is about $91 billion. With a population of 2.4 million people, we export over half what the entire United States of America export to China. And we've done that with a royalty system. So it's a pretty efficient system looked at in that way. I think that the Commonwealth government, from my experience as a state treasurer, they just made a mess of it. I mean, I don't think that federal Labor bureaucrats or politicians understood the basic mechanics of the resource industry or how you might extract tax from them.
Thank you very much for your support.
Pleasure.
Thank you.